New web developers can often struggle with the concept of divs and other structural elements like the header element, the nav element, the footer element, and trying to make sense of exactly what those do. And then you throw in another element called the span element, and it can get extra confusing because the span element is different in some ways than the div, header, nav, and footer elements. So let's talk a little bit about what those are, and we're looking at my example site here, celiactive.com, which is just set up very minimally with some placeholder images, some very minimal styles, but we're using this really just to demonstrate some concepts. So let's look at the code for this page, and I'm looking at the CSS page here. Let's switch to look at the HTML file, and if you look at this, you see we're swimming in a bit of a div soup. So we've got our head information up here at the top. We're linking to our style sheet, then we are opening up the content of our page with the body tag, but then we're going straight into a div, followed by a header, which is also a structural element that's within that div, followed by a nav element, followed by not just one but two more divs, one div stuck within another div. We close that off, close off the other one, and then here we are with another div, and these have these attributes in here called IDs, and some have attributes called classes. What is going on? Let's just take a look at our page after we've added a style here to help us to see these divs. So don't get too hung up on the style that I'm using, but just note that I'm going to create a style here to highlight or to outline the divs on the page. So I'm putting in a style to style every div on the page, so I'm not differentiating divs by one ID or class or another. I'm just styling all of them. And I'm just going to put a margin around each of these divs of 5 pixels, or let's do 10 pixels around all sides of the div. And I'm also going to create a border that's going to be 1 pixel wide, it's going to be black, and it's going to be just a solid line. So that's shorthand notation and styles. In CSS. That's something you should pick up later on in this course. But let's go ahead and save. And we'll switch to our browser and we'll refresh the page. And now you see all of our divs are outlined in a black border, and it's got a margin around it so that we can actually see divs as they're nested within each other. And that margin just adds space around the div itself. So you can start to see now what a div is. So here's the div that we started out right after the body tag. This is a div that goes around all of the content in the page, and so we have one big box that goes around all of the content, and then within that we have another box. Big box here, a big box there, a big box here, and within some of these bigger boxes we have smaller boxes. So these are all divs, every single one of them that's outlined. And so you can start to see what we're doing. We're taking certain chunks of code and we're grouping it into a block. Now once we've grouped it into a block, then we can start to style that block according to our needs. So some things you will notice though is that we don't have any blocks around the header, we don't have any blocks around the nav, we don't have any blocks around the footer, because these are different structural elements. They aren't divs. They're still structural elements, but they aren't divs, and so we aren't seeing them. And now if we wanted to see them, this is just a quick aside, we could come over and in our style we could target those as well. So we could separate them by commas here so that we can add additional elements that we want to style. But we could style the header, the nav, and the footer as well. So let's just go ahead and save, switch to our browser, hit refresh, and now you see there's our footer that's outlined, there's our nav that's outlined, there's our header that's outlined as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep playing with this idea of styling these divs here, these blocks, to show how grouping things up into divs and headers and footers can allow us to be able to style chunks of HTML all together. So let's go back to our CSS page, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to now take advantage of some of these IDs and classes to target specific divs. So here I've got a class, I have a div that has the class of product item. Okay, so let's say I want to just style any divs that have that class, product item. So I'm going to go to my CSS page, and I'm going to go put a style here for div. Now I'm going to put the selector for the class, so I'm going to do a dot product item. So I'm just targeting any divs with the class of product item, and I use a dot to signify a class. And I'm going to give this a width of 100 pixels, which is as wide as those placeholder images. Okay, so let's just save that. So I just used Command S on my keyboard to save, and I'm going to go and refresh. And you see automatically on refresh there, our div now, you can see by the border, is just 100 pixels wide. And so, like that, we've resized and caused to wrap all of these, the text within these divs, and we've just basically put a nice border around our image and around our text. So we can continue to play around a little bit with this. Let's go back to our style. Now let's just say, let's put a background color on these divs of just 6Cs, which should be gray. So we'll save over here, we'll reload, and there you go. You see just these divs, they all have a gray background now. And we could go even further. We could play around a little bit with the font. So we could say font family Tahoma Arial Sans Serif. And I just hit Command R to reload there, and you see our font changes as well. Okay, so you get the idea. The further we go into CSS, the more we'll be able to do with divs. So we can use CSS to now take each of these individual divs to, say, line them up sideways, or to put a rounded border around them, or to just completely hide everything that's within this div. You name it. There's so much that we can do. Once we've organized everything into a div, we can use CSS to style that div as a block and do quite a lot with it. Now we could even target this larger div that this is sitting within. So ultimately what we would do, according to our wireframe, is use CSS to take this featured products div and this featured articles content div, and to size them down so that they're taking less space in the larger element that they're sitting within. And then we could line them up next to each other. So in reality, what we would do if we were to keep working on this is we would take this div, we would shrink it down to about 75% of the width of this larger box here. We would float that over to the left. We'd take this box here, we'd shrink it down to about 25%, and we'd float it over to the right, and we'd just float them next to each other, and have that two-column layout that we're after. So we won't worry a lot about that today. We'll get into that into future weeks, but I just want you to get the idea here of what a div is all about. Okay, so what's the difference between a div and a span? So let's switch here and take a look at our HTML code. And you'll notice that we've got a couple of span elements. Now the biggest difference between a div and a span, both are used to group code together so that you can style it in a group. But the biggest difference between a div and a span is that a div is considered a block level element, and a span can be an inline element. So it can be something that that occurs within a block, and it doesn't cause. So I'll show you an example. It's a little bit easier to demonstrate. So here in this paragraph we have a span of class lead text, and we end the span here. So let's just come back to our main.css file, and let's just create a style for that. So span, we'll go lead, so we'll target the class here, lead text. Okay, and we will go, let's just say text size. We'll make this a lot larger. We'll make this 24 pixels in text size. So we'll just save, go back, hit refresh. Oops, I should have said font size. Okay, font size. Haha. Now I should have known better, because when I first typed text size, I didn't get this nice blue highlighting here. So text editors are pretty good at sometimes letting you know when you're putting in the right term or keyword or whatever you call it or not, by just highlighting it if it's correct and failing to highlight it if it's not. So I'll save. Over here, let's try that again. We'll refresh, and now you see here this text is now displaying larger than all of the text around it. So we've used a span to style a group of HTML, but it's displaying inline. It's not creating another block. And what I mean by a block is something that occupies really just an entire horizontal space. Here the span can finish up, and more HTML can continue to flow to the right of it here. So a span can display inline naturally rather than as a block element. So hopefully that makes sense. And anyway, that's all we'll cover in this, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.